Hope everybody's having a great day today. We're going to start our U.S. history class today, and we're going to start with something that I shared with all of you in Google Docs on Google Classroom. Please, before we start the lesson today, please go to Google Classroom and find the Gilded Age and Progressivism worksheet. What I want all of you guys to do is I want you to watch each short video on YouTube with the link, and then answer the questions and turn this in before we start the lesson. So right here, here's the link to the YouTube video. You'll watch each video. There's 3 videos listed with questions that pertain to each video. Watch the video, each video, answer the questions, and then we'll get started. So what you want to do right now is pause this video and do this assignment, turn it in, and then we'll get started with the lesson. Okay, you should have completed the Gilded Age and Progressivism assignment, watching the 3 YouTube videos and answering the questions. We're going to move on now to life in the 1900s, and a lot of what you saw in the video we'll talk about, okay? So life in the 1900s, we learned about the Industrial Revolution and what went on during the Industrial Revolution. Progressive, okay? The word progressive starts coming about during this time, and it's a group of people, a person, or an idea favoring or implementing social reform or new liberal ideas, okay? With America at this time, during America coming out of the Industrial Revolution, there were some reforms that needed to be made within business, reforms such as monopolies, employee benefit reforms, as well as employee safety reforms at the time during the Industrial Revolution. Remember, we talked about how there were no child labor laws, as well as there were no safety laws for working in factories and whatnot. Through this 1900s and through the progressive movement, many of these laws came into action. One key figure we're going to talk about is Teddy Roosevelt. He really spearheaded the progressive movement. He was president from 1901 to 1909, and he was the youngest person elected president at the age of 42. Roosevelt was a leader of the progressive movement, and he championed his Square Deal, which we'll learn about. His Square Deal included domestic policies promising the average citizen fairness, breaking trusts, regulating the railroads, and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Teddy Roosevelt, we're going to focus on just a little bit. He was kind of born as a sickly child. He had debilitating asthma, but he overcame his health problems by embracing what he called the strenuous lifestyle. Roosevelt visited the Dakota Territories in 1883 to hunt bison. He really loved this cowboy way of life, coming from New York, going out to the Dakotas, and really invested money in hopes of becoming a great cattle rancher. He would go back and forth between New York and his ranch in the Dakotas. We have a picture of him at that time in the Dakotas. Teddy Roosevelt was also commanded a cavalry regiment during the Spanish-American War, which we learned a little bit about. And he took his Rough Riders and captured Kettle Hill, also known as San Juan Hill. And Roosevelt took office as vice president in March 1909 and assumed the presidency at age 42 when McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt developed antitrust laws, and this is something that's very important. These are laws that protected consumers from unfair business practices by making it illegal for businesses to compete in unfair ways. An example was a company lowering a price in a certain geographic area to push out competition. So for today, for example, antitrust laws would be if Walmart lowered pricing so much that it pushed out all the other grocery stores in a certain geographic area, like let's say Southern California, and then Walmart became the only grocery store in Southern California, that would be a violation of antitrust laws. Okay, President Roosevelt developed the Square Deal, also known as the 3 C's, okay? Conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. These were the 3 C's, okay, that President Roosevelt created. Conserve the natural resources, control of corporations, and then consumer protection. Roosevelt created the national parks, monuments, and forests. These are protected by the government as part of his Square Deal. Americans wanted to end big business, right? We learned about during the Industrial Revolution, and we watched videos on Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the big businesses that they developed, and how in some ways it could rip off the consumer because these businesses were so big, for example, like the railroads, that they controlled pricing in certain areas. Americans did not like that. Big business had created a monopoly in certain industries, which we had talked about. This created price control and hurt the consumer. President Roosevelt created this great quote, which he called the man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. And this really sums up President Roosevelt's attitude. Okay, so just to review, progressive is a group of people, a person or idea favoring implementing social reform. So problems and solutions, let's talk about this. In the 1900s, industrialization, urbanization, and immigration were contributing to the great changes in American lifestyle. During the 1900s, we had many immigrants coming from New York that were helping with the Industrial Revolution and helping to work in factories. Progressives during this time wanted to take action in response to these problems. They wanted to improve society by promoting social welfare, protecting the environment, and making the government more efficient. Political and religious roots of progressivism came from our presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, who we'll learn about. Progressives wanted to improve conditions for farmers and industrial workers. They wanted to curb the power of big business and how much business these big businesses really controlled, such as Rockefeller and Carnegie with oil, railroads, steamboat business. They wanted to allow other people to have an opportunity to build business in similar industries. They wanted to make government accessible to every citizen. Many progressives were also inspired by the religious ideas of the social gospel movement at the time. This movement was based on the idea that social reform and Christianity went hand in hand. So you have three progressive presidents that helped during this time. You have Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Okay, this is a picture of William McKinley, who was president and was assassinated, and Roosevelt at the time was the vice president and then became the president. Roosevelt was VP under McKinley, and then McKinley was assassinated in 1901. Roosevelt then became the youngest president at age of 42. So Roosevelt's square deal. Roosevelt believed that businesses, workers, and consumers should all receive a square deal. They all deserved fair and honest treatment. And at this time, workers and consumers were not treated fairly. At this time, there were no child labor laws. There was no safety laws for workers in factories, and a lot of the managers of these factories could work workers as long and as much as they wanted. Some of these factories, workers would work 6 to 7 days a week, 10 to 12-hour days. President Roosevelt went out to change that and to create reforms that protected the worker and the consumer. His program of reforms became known as the Square Deal, which we talked about. The Square Deal focused on regulating the big businesses and created laws such as child labor laws, where there would be certain ages where kids could work, such as they could not work until they were 16 years old, and they could only work for a certain amount of hours a day. Roosevelt spearheaded these reforms, which were much needed. So, discussion question. I want you to pause the video and go to Google Classroom. There's a discussion post. In your opinion, what businesses from the Industrial Revolution needed to be regulated? Why do you believe these businesses needed to be regulated? So pause this video, go to Google Classroom, and respond to the discussion post, please. Okay, you should have responded to the discussion post, which will be graded later on, as well as you need to respond to 2 other classmates' discussion posts. So busting trust. Roosevelt needed to bust trust to regulate monopolies. Okay, we talked about what a monopoly is. It's where a business controls has complete control in a certain area. For example, let's say Walmart came into Southern California and lowered all of their prices. That put all the other grocery stores out of business because Walmart's prices were so low that Vons, Ralph's, and all the other grocery stores in Southern California had to go out of business, creating Walmart as the only grocery store in Southern California. That would be a monopoly. Okay, so like I said, definition of monopoly, the exclusive possession or control of the supply of or trade in a commodity or service. What I'd like you guys to do now is to read page 234 and respond to the discussion prompt on Google Classroom. So pause this video, read page 234 in your textbook, and then respond to the discussion prompt in Google Classroom. Once you've done responding to the prompt, you can come back to this video. At this time, you should have read page 234 and responded to the discussion prompt on Google Classroom. So protecting consumers, Roosevelt created the Meat Inspection Act. The Meat Inspection Act required the Department of Agriculture to inspect packaged meats. This law was in response to a term called muckrakers accounts of unsanitary meat packing plants. And muckrakers were business owners that really didn't care about the average consumer, that would sell them anything. Even if, for example, the meat had expired, they would still sell it. And at this time, there was a lot of, meat being sold that was packaged that had expired, that consumers would buy and wouldn't know it had expired until they had gotten home and were trying to use the meat to cook and realized it was expired. You also had the Food and Drug Act. The Pure Food and Drug Act established a new agency, the Food and Drug Administration. This agency tested and approved drugs before they went on the market. At this time, you had a lot of drugs being put on the market that would say they were one thing, but wouldn't be what they said to be. For example, you could buy Tylenol and it would say, it was a pain reliever when in fact, maybe it wasn't a pain reliever. So this was again to protect the consumers. Roosevelt also created the National Forest Service and National Parks. Please read page 236 in your textbook and respond to the Google Classroom prompt. After you have done this, you can return back to this video. All right, you should have read page 236 and responded to the discussion question in Google Classroom. Make sure you also respond to 2 other classmates' discussion posts. So the Progressive Party continued to move after Roosevelt was president. Taft then won the presidency, who was a Republican, just like Roosevelt. After Taft had been president for a term, Roosevelt led a third party called the Bull Moose Party, or also the Progressive Party. Roosevelt felt President Taft was moving away from the what progressive America needed. So in the election of 1912, Taft was running as a Republican and won the Republican nominee. Woodrow Wilson was running as a Democrat, and then you had President Roosevelt running again for president as the Progressive Party, or also known as the Bull Moose Party. It got named the Bull Moose Party because when Roosevelt created the party, he said, "I feel as fit as a bull moose to run," and so it became known as the Bull Moose Party. Woodrow Wilson then won the election of 1912. One thing that President Wilson did was the Revenue Act of 1913, which lowered tariffs and implemented a federal income tax to help pay for certain things the government needed to do. Okay, at this time, we've completed the PowerPoint presentation. I'm going to share with you a Google document that you need to complete. You need to define the following terms here from the lesson, as well as answer these assessment questions in Google Docs from Google Classroom. So today you need to have completed certain things. First is these key terms here, as well as the assessment. So this needs to be handed in today. Key terms in the assessment from the lesson. Also, you need to hand in today your Gilded Age and Progressive video worksheet. You should have done this before the lesson. It's in Google Classroom. You'll watch these 3 short YouTube videos and answer the following questions. And the last thing that should all be completed, if you followed the lesson here, is all of the Google Classroom discussion posts from this lesson need to be completed today, as well as you need to respond to 2 classmates' discussion posts to facilitate a discussion. All right, thank you for watching the video. Make sure you get your work done and hand it in on time. Email me or send me a message in Google Classroom if you have any questions.